At the end of World War II on December 16, 1944, Lieutenant Thomas Hart received orders to escort an Allied soldier to the base in Sunvin. That morning he set out on the mission. Although Hart held the rank of lieutenant, he had never seen combat. His father, a government official, had shielded him from the front lines. After several hours of driving, they reached a border post. The guards claimed they were going the wrong way, even though the map showed the route was correct. Sensing danger, the captain drew his weapon and shot both guards. They were enemy soldiers in disguise. While the captain looted bottles of alcohol from the back seat, Hart hit the gas to escape. More enemy soldiers appeared and opened fire. The area had already been captured. Hart lost control of the vehicle under heavy gunfire and crashed, ending up among the bodies of fallen soldiers. His war had just begun. This is Hart's war. Captured, Hart was taken to a detention house for interrogation. He faced repeated torture because he held a rank linked to military planning. His captors stripped him of his clothes and left him in freezing conditions. Temperatures dropped to -40°C, and the cold burned his feet. After 3 days he was moved to a prison camp with hundreds of other captives. They traveled by train through snowy mountains. Many froze to death. Hart survived only because a fellow prisoner gave him a coat. When the train arrived at the main station, Allied aircraft attacked. Gunfire struck the train cars and killed dozens of prisoners. One man climbed through a window to unlock the carriage so others could escape. Hart tried to carry the prisoner who had helped him, but an explosion threw the man's body aside. As the attack continued, the remaining prisoners formed a line and waved to signal the pilots to stop firing. When the air raid ended, enemy soldiers forced the survivors to line up. Hart stood silent, staring at his comrade's body as someone urged him to take the dead man's shoes and socks. The march through the snowy mountains was far from over. Several days later, after a brutal trek, the prisoners reached Osberg prison in Germany. At the gate, guards forced them to watch the execution of inmates who had tried to escape, a warning that even a prison fenced only with barbed wire could not be defied. Among the captives was Colonel William McNamara. Even as a prisoner, he argued with the guards. Conditions here were not as harsh as in many other camps, because the facility followed the Geneva Convention. Prisoners of war received food, shelter, and medical care. New high-ranking prisoners were sent to meet McNamara in his barracks. He questioned Hart about how long he had been detained and who had interrogated him. These questions tested whether Hart had revealed any information. Most men who refused to talk were tortured for 7 days. Hart had faced only 3, which made others suspect he had betrayed his side. Hart did not see the trap in the questions. When McNamara assigned him to a lower-level barracks despite empty beds in the officers' quarters, Hart remained puzzled. His loyalty was clear. The day before, he had refused to take shoes from a dead man and had walked hundreds of kilometers without socks, even as his feet swelled. Prisoners in Barracks 27 were surprised to see a lieutenant among them. Hart received unexpected attention, and the conditions were better than he expected. Bradford, one of the prisoners, even offered him cigarettes. That night the barracks were locked from outside. Hart woke to use the bathroom and found Bradford following him. Bradford was not there for the toilet. Beneath the drain was a tunnel leading outside. He had gone through it only to find shoes and socks for Hart. The gesture left Hart smiling in gratitude. The next morning the prisoners lined up in the yard. 2 new black prisoners arrived, their uniforms marking them as fighter pilots. In the mid-1940s, racial prejudice was open and harsh. Despite their rank and service, many viewed their presence as a disgrace. McNamara refused to place them in the officers' quarters and sent them to the lower-level barracks with Hart. As soon as the 2 lieutenants entered, hostility flared. Bradford, usually friendly, turned cold and hurled insults, nearly starting a fight. The next morning Hart confronted Bradford about his behavior. Bradford ignored the reprimand and continued to insult Lieutenants Scott and Archer. When Hart defended them, Bradford threatened to take back the shoes he had given and demanded something valuable in return. No one else spoke to the 2 black officers. Only Hart treated them with respect. Scott and Archer stayed calm, accustomed to such prejudice. Bradford, however, kept looking for ways to drive them out. That night guards stormed the barracks, accusing someone of picking up a sharp piece of metal near the fence. The rules called for harsh punishment. When no one confessed, the guards searched the room and found the metal under Archer's mattress. The trap was obvious, but the accusation stood. Archer was dragged outside and executed. Scott erupted in anger, but the guards ignored him. Everyone knew Bradford was responsible, yet no one acted. Colonel McNamara arrived and demanded to know why the execution happened without a proper hearing. The offense did not merit death. His challenge exposed the deep prejudice shared by both guards and prisoners. Determined to find the truth, McNamara planned to question his own men. The prison commander, Warner, saw this as defiance and threatened to search McNamara's barracks. A hidden radio inside made that threat dangerous, since discovery would cut off their only source of war news. After the execution, McNamara visited Hart again. Bradford's guilt was clear, but he faced no punishment. The next day, all prisoners gathered in the theater building. Airplanes roared overhead as a battle raged in the sky. The inmates cheered for the American pilots who seemed to be winning. Bradford shouted with excitement. Scott quietly told him that the pilot they admired was from his own unit and was also black. The remark nearly sparked a fight, but a sudden crash silenced them. A plane slammed into the prison fence, tearing away a quarter of the theater building. McNamara watched the damage with unusual concern and stayed near the structure through the night. Later that night, after the barracks fell silent, Hart noticed that the mattress beside him was empty. Lieutenant Scott and Bradford were both gone. They had likely slipped out through the tunnel beneath the latrine. Hart tried to follow, but he was too late. Bradford was soon found dead with Scott lying nearby. The discovery was enough to charge Scott with murder. Colonel McNamara argued that a prisoner accused of such a crime could not be executed without a trial. Scott might have been framed. The warden agreed and scheduled a hearing in the theater building, allowing only 1 week before the space was converted into new barracks. As the guards prepared to remove Bradford's body, Hart asked that it be photographed first. Before the war, he had studied law at a top American university, and his request followed proper procedure. Recognizing Hart's legal knowledge, McNamara appointed him as Scott's defense lawyer. The next morning, Hart met Scott and advised him to admit to a fight as self-defense. Scott rejected the idea and insisted he had never touched Bradford. If Scott was telling the truth, someone else was responsible for the killing. That night, McNamara warned Hart to avoid revealing the tunnels during the trial. If the guards discovered them, the prisoners would lose their escape route. Later, while examining Bradford's body again, Hart was surprised when the warden, Warner, arrived with photographs from the scene. Warner, also trained in law, seemed willing to help Hart uncover the truth despite being on the opposing side. The trial began the following morning. Witnesses described the events of the night, but none had seen Scott attack Bradford. The case shifted when Bradford's friend Webb testified that he had watched Scott commit the murder through a window. Hart knew this was impossible, because Webb had been beside him the entire time. Still, the court accepted the false statement. After the hearing, Hart confronted Webb in private. Driven by vengeance, Webb chose to lie, determined to see Scott condemned. Webb's testimony left Scott resigned and convinced that justice would fail him. Hart's sympathy deepened. When hope seemed gone, Warner appeared again and handed Hart a book of military court regulations. He told Hart that careful reading would reveal legal gaps strong enough to save Scott's life. Warner's gesture showed a quiet respect for fairness and a belief that war was a struggle between leaders, not between ordinary men. The next day, Hart shifted the trial by exposing multiple violations of military law from the previous hearing. He then argued that Colonel McNamara could not serve as a neutral judge and requested his removal. The challenge stunned the colonel, who called Hart outside for a private talk. McNamara was not angry about losing the argument. He was angry that Hart accepted help from the warden. In his view, prisoners should never cooperate with the enemy. That night, McNamara went to Warner's quarters. The warden was drunk and invited him to drink. A gun lay on the table, giving McNamara a clear chance to kill him. He did not take it. Any attack would have brought guards rushing in and ended in disaster. He had come only to warn Warner to stay out of the trial. Meanwhile, Hart studied the crime scene photos and noticed black dust on Bradford's face and hands. He reconstructed the killing and concluded that the attacker was someone close to the victim who had broken his neck from behind. The dark marks looked like shoe polish used for cover in the dark. This detail weakened the case against Scott. A black man had no reason to smear his skin with polish. The prosecution argued that the stains came from the filthy latrine tunnel that Scott had used to leave the barracks. Scott saw the trial's true purpose. It was not about justice, but about finding a scapegoat. His rank and service meant nothing against the prejudice around him. That night, Hart lay awake, remembering a detail from days earlier. Before his death, Bradford had hidden something behind a wooden board near his bed. Hart checked the spot and found what Bradford had concealed. The next day, Hart surprised the court by calling Warner to testify. Warner agreed with enthusiasm, unaware of Hart's real goal. Hart wanted proof that Bradford had worked with the guards. Hidden near Bradford's bunk were German currency and a German passport, items no prisoner could have obtained without help. The evidence showed that guards had cooperated with Bradford to frame Lieutenant Archer. In return, Bradford had revealed the location of Colonel McNamara's hidden radio, explaining how the guards found it so quickly. The case was still weak. If the guards had killed Bradford, why would they strangle him by hand and leave shoe polish on their own faces? Unable to sleep, Hart followed a trail of prisoners who often slipped away after dark. He tracked them to the theater building and into a storage room. Beneath the floor, he found a hidden project. Hart went straight to the colonel's barracks and discovered men forging fake passports identical to the one Bradford carried. The truth came into focus. Bradford's killer was Colonel McNamara. Bradford had been close to exposing the secret tunnel to the guards. The earlier theory was nearly right. Bradford had played both sides and had cooperated with the enemy to frame and kill Lieutenant Archer. Scott was accused of murder only to buy time. Without the trial, the theater building would have been demolished a week earlier. The real plan was not only to escape, but also to destroy the nearby ammunition factory. To protect that mission, McNamara was willing to risk Scott's life. The next day, all prisoners lined up in the yard for the final session of the trial. McNamara feigned illness, so another officer would act as judge. Hart burned with anger at the thought of sacrificing a comrade without explanation. When he found a moment, he told Scott the truth. Scott felt relief instead of rage. He accepted the idea of giving his life for the mission and asked Hart to tell his son how he died. Hart stood silent, unsettled by Scott's calm resolve, while McNamara's men quietly dug a tunnel for their night escape. When the trial reached its final stage, Hart used his defense to stall, speaking at length so 35 men could slip away unnoticed. He then stunned the court by claiming responsibility for Bradford's death to protect Lieutenant Scott. Warner, the warden, felt betrayed and ordered Hart dragged out for execution. Guards and prisoners gathered to witness it. A guard then reported that 35 men were missing from the lineup, including Colonel McNamara. Moments later, a loud noise came from behind the theater doors, raising Warner's suspicion that the trial had been a cover for an escape. He ordered all involved to be executed. Before the order was carried out, McNamara returned. He had successfully escaped but chose to come back. As silence fell, a massive explosion shattered the air. The nearby ammunition factory had been destroyed, completing the mission. McNamara offered his own life to spare the others, explaining that his men had only followed orders. The guards shot him on the spot. The prisoners gave him a final salute, recognizing his sacrifice. Warner, keeping his word, spared the remaining captives. 3 months later, the war ended, leaving open the question of whether McNamara's death had been necessary. So the moral of the story is never play hide and seek with shoe polish, maps, and secret tunnels unless you are ready for explosions, courtroom drama, and a surprise salute.